2 of the Eleusinian Mysteries. Hercules is the archetype of the spiritual warrior. What were supposed to be originally 10 labors became 12, partly because of the processes of myth and history, and later myth because the person who charged him with the labors decided that 2 of them would not be accepted. They were then assigned to the zodiacal wheel from Aries to Pisces, and became an emblem for the evolution of the soul and its stages of development towards immortality. The writings of the philosophers and people associated with the Arctic mysteries interpreted in this way. We're going to have a reading from the 12 Labors of Hercules by Edith Custer. This is a modern theosophical approach, but it is something that will give you the flavor of what was done in ancient times with the interpretation of the Labors of Hercules. The 12 Labors of Hercules form an allegory of the great work undertaken by the human soul after reaching an advanced level of development. Hercules symbolizes the disciple, learning the most important lessons of life as represented by the 12 constellations of the zodiac. This framework has for centuries been used to illustrate these esoteric truths. While the story is interesting as an ancient heroic adventure, it is far more significant as a key to the final stages of the divine plan for human evolution as described in the perennial philosophy or ageless wisdom. Each task assigned, each animal encountered is symbolic of something all souls will experience when they reach these advanced stages. So I'm going to read you the first labor, which is associated with the sign of Aries. And this is not the actual mythological first labor, it's the labor of capturing the wild mares of Diomedes. It's associated with the sign of Aries. Sign of Lamb or rugged ram, the first of Hercules' great tasks began. He now learned to affirm with strength, I am the Son of God and also Son of Man. In this first labor, Hercules came forth to know himself a spirit brave and true, whose will aligned with highest will of all, desired the good to know and love and do. His work was to defeat the man-eating mares who ravaged all the land with devilish deeds, and he sought young Abderus, his friend, to help in cornering these fierce and fiery steeds. They followed them o'er meadow, marsh, and plain till they had tethered the ferocious pack. But Hercules then to his friend assigned the task of driving those wild horses back. Young Abderus had not the power and strength. They turned and killed him in a fearful fate, and when grief-stricken Hercules returned, he saw his great mistake, but 'twas too late. Then sad but wiser, our bold hero went again to catch and tie the savage steeds, and this time drove them safely back himself, thus ending all their wild destructive deeds. Though he succeeded, his first task was flawed. Yet one truth he had learned, and well he knew, if you're assigned a job, you see it through and don't tell someone else to go and do. Wild horses are in symbol lower forms in need of self-control and spirit light. For though his will was strong, his lower self, as Abderus, lacked strength and deeper sight. The sign of Aries, head of fiery ram with horns turned down to earthy matters traits, depicts the thinker's spiritual will to express good in outer forms and states. The higher will sustains intent and effort, reflecting purpose, power, and perfect plan. Intelligence and love were also needed for Hercules' release as perfect man. In this first labor, he had gotten off to a regrettable, grief-saddened start. But learning from mistakes, he then went on with building character, life's greatest art. Now let's take a look at the 12 labors of Hercules as they are represented in myth and legend. His first labor was to destroy the Nemean lion. Herakles shot an arrow at him, but when he perceived that the lion was invulnerable, he broke its neck with his bare hands. His second labor consisted of being ordered by Eurystheus to kill the Lernaean Hydra, which was the offspring of Typhon and Echidna, a monster with 9 heads, one of them being immortal. He chopped all heads, and the immortal one he buried, putting a heavy rock on it. So he was able to conquer these divinely created beasts in spite of their seemingly invulnerable and invincible power. Now, the third labor was the order to bring the Cernician hind alive to Mycenae. Now, the hind had golden horns and was sacred to Artemis, and so Herakles did not wish to wound it, but at the end he shot it just as it was about to cross a river. He caught it, and he hastened through Arcadia towards Mycenae, but Artemis and Apollo met him and rebuked him for attempting to kill her sacred hind. But Herakles blamed Eurystheus and pleaded necessity, and so he appeased Artemis's anger and carried the hind alive to Mycenae. The fourth labor was the order to bring the Ermanthian boar, which ravaged an entire area, back alive. This he did so successfully, but while he was hunting the boar, he was received by Pholus, the centaur. And in the occasion, as we said, a jar or flask of wine was opened that actually was owned by all the centaurs in common. They had a fight, and Herakles repelled them. They went and hid in the same area that the wise old master centaur Chiron was living, and accidentally Herakles shot Chiron with a poisoned arrow. The wound was incurable, and so Chiron renounced his immortality in favor of Prometheus, which sends Herakles later into a great task to rescue the Redeemer of mankind, the Greek Christ, Prometheus. Sorry. Now, the fifth labor was to carry out the dung of the cattle of Augeas, who was the king of Elis, in a single day. And so he went to this king, who was a kind of a trickster, and actually someone he later had to defeat in battle, and said that he would carry out the dung in one day if Augeas would give him the 10th part of the cattle. But Augeas promised, and taking Augeas' son as a witness, he made a breach in the foundations of the cattle yard and diverted the courses of 2 rivers and turned them into the yard. And by doing this feat, he was able to rid the yard and remove the dung from the yard in one day. And however, when Augeas learned that this had been accomplished at the command of Eurystheus, he refused to pay the reward. Later on, Herakles would pay him back in kind for this nasty deed. But I want you to note that diverting rivers is considered to be a heroic task. The idea of diverting a river is something we find attributed to the later great philosophers who are in the tradition of the Pholarcus, the great masters of descent into the divine underworld. And so this characteristic, this task of Herakles is a heroic task, and the diverting of rivers is considered to be from that point on, just like the death by immolation, a sign of the heroes who deserve apotheosis. Now, the sixth labor was to chase the man-eating birds away. They had used their feathers as arrows, They lived in the Stymphalian Lake in Arcadia. Now, Athena gave Herakles some brazen castanets, which she had received from Hephaestus, and by clashing these on a certain mountain that overhung the lake, he was able to scare the birds away. They couldn't stand the sound, and they fluttered up in the sky, and in that way, he shot them with arrows, or with a sling. He was therefore able to clear the area of these man-eating birds. The seventh labor was to bring the Cretan bull to his unworthy master, and Herakles came to Crete to find this bull and ask for aid, but King Minos told him to fight the bull for himself. These are parts of the ancient Minotaur legends, which are probably rooted in the underground rumblings of earthquakes and things like this. But Herakles was able to catch it and bring it to Eurystheus, and after showing the bull to him, he let the bull go free. Now, the eighth labor was to deal with the man-eating mares, the horses that were running free. We had read one interpretation of that particular labor, which is associated in the zodiac with Aries. So Herakles sailed with some volunteers to Thrace, and he overpowered the grooms and drove the mares to the sea and committed the mares to the guardianship of Abderus, who, of course, was killed by them. But in the course of this, Herakles had to fight a war and a battle, defeat the army, found a city, and he gave the mares finally to Eurystheus, and Eurystheus let them go free, and they were then destroyed by the wild beasts in Mount Olympus. Now, the ninth labor was to fetch the belt of Hippolyta, who was queen of the Amazons. She had the belt of Ares for being the best among the Amazons. Hercules was sent to fetch it because Admete, who was the daughter of Eurystheus, wanted to get it. And so when he arrived at the land of the Amazons, a fight broke out, and Herakles killed Hippolyte, and stripped her of her belt, and having defeated the rest, he sailed away to Troy, and finally got back to Mycenae and gave the belt to Eurysthenes. One of the things that was considered to be very difficult was to defeat an Amazon or a witch. Later on in the Hellenistic tradition, for a warrior to kill a witch was considered to be a very powerful and virile act. And for a man to be able to kill an Amazon who had almost magical powers was considered to be a very powerful and virile act. Today, the killing of a woman is considered by a man who is a warrior is considered to be an act of cowardice. But in these legends, these women were very, very powerful. Remember, we're coming from a time when women had great power, and some of them were great warriors. Here's a representation of the belt, and there are other myths and stories that involve his not having to obtain the belt by killing Hippolyta, but that she actually gives it to him because she falls in love with him. So there are many stories about this. As a 10th laborer, he is ordered to fetch the cattle of Geryon. Geryon lived in the island of Erythia, and he had the body of 3 men grown together and joined in one at the waist, but parted in 3 from the flanks and the thighs. The cattle were guarded by Orthus, which was a 2-headed hound. And when the dog and Eurytion herdsmen of Geryon saw Herakles coming. They attacked him, but Herakles killed them both. And another person who was there observing reported to Geryon the presence of Herakles, and Geryon attacked him, but Herakles killed him too and took his cattle away, and after several adventures, he gave the cattle to Eurystheus. Here is a representation of the battle for the cattle and the successes of Herakles. Now, Eurystheus ordered Herakles as the 11th laborer, and what he did not do is he did not acknowledge the two of the previous labors as legitimate, and so it would be actually the 9th of his 10 labors, but actually really was the 11th labor. And he ordered him to fetch the golden apples of the Hesperides. They were among the Hyperboreans, and they were presented to by Gaia, to Zeus, after his marriage with Hera, and guarded by an immortal dragon with 100 heads. There are some stories that say that Herakles came and asked Atlas to fetch the apples for him and offered to relieve him in his task of holding up the world on his shoulders, which Herakles did as a stand-in while Atlas received the apples for him. Or others say that he just killed the dragon and took the apples himself. But this story is considered to be a very powerful act. And here he is, a representation of the apples being received. Now, at this point, Herakles is initiated at Eleusis in the Lesser Mysteries, which are very often called the Lesser Mysteries of Herakles. And he's initiated because only by being initiated at Eleusis is he able to do the final labor, because the final labor involves descending into the divine underworld, the world of Persephone and Pluto and Hades. And in order to do that, he has to be empowered by being initiated at the Eleusinian Mysteries. And this is after he has committed the greatest of the acts of liberation by rescuing Prometheus from the eagle, releasing him from his rock, and giving him back his immortality. And Prometheus is the one who brought life and nous and the fire of mind and immortality to human beings. He's, as I said, some people call him the mythological Greek Christ. So the 12th task imposed upon Herakles was to bring Cerberus from Hades. When Herakles went to Hades, he found Theseus, who was and rescued him. And when Herakles asked asked Hades for the dog Cerberus, Hades or Pluto told him that he could take it if he could master him without any weapons. So Herakles flung his arms around Cerberus's heads, or at least around one of them, and though the dragon in the dog's tail bit him, he did not release the beast, and he ascended to the earth and showed it to Eurystheus and carried it back to Hades. Now, after the completion of all these things and many other things, came the death and apotheosis of Herakles. And Herakles is the archetype of the human who ascends into the heavens and becomes immortal. This is a medieval painting of the ascension of Herakles into the heavens. We're going to look a little more closely at what this means in terms of initiation. And now this brings us to the Lesser Mysteries of Eleusis, that are sometimes called the mysteries of Herakles. Now, it's very difficult to find representations of the mysteries at all. And there are very few of the lesser mysteries. But I'm going to be able to describe some of them to you in a way that I think you'll find to be very interesting. There is a cinerary urn called the Lovatelli urn and a Terra Nova sarcophagus that depict the lesser mysteries of Eleusis and the initiation of Herakles. I do not have those particular images to show you, but I'm going to describe what is on the urns, and this is a description that is made by another observer, J.N. Casavas. It's very clear, by the way, on the urn that we have a lion skin, and the figure in the lion skin is Herakles, and it probably depicts the lesser mysteries. And here's what he tells us, and again, we're not looking at exactly what he's describing, but I've got something that's close to it for you to see. In the first picture, he is seated upon the low sacred couch, right arm and breast bare. Hoodwinked, that is, he has a blindfold on. This is not, in this picture, he's not hoodwinked, but he's making sacrifices at this point. He's blindfolded, and he's unshod, or slipshod. That means one shoe on and one shoe off. The seat is covered with the skin of a lion. His feet are resting on the lion skin instead of making use of the ram skin on which the other candidates for initiation were standing. Now, this is not the image we're looking at. This is the image on the Lovatelli urn and the Terra Nova sarcophagus. In his left hand, he holds a torch, emblematic of purification by fire. He is also represented on the right of the picture, standing by the Hierophant. Now, the position and the hands that torches are held in are very significant. Later, when we look at the Mithraic mysteries, we will see the actual representations of the positions and mudras in which torches were held, each of them being significant of something in the mysteries. Now, Demeter is seated on the symbolic kista, or kiste, which is covered with the sheepskin, and Aeacus, who is the secret god of the mysteries, is standing on her right. And in the urn, Herakles is also hoodwinked, right arm and breast bare. So we're quite certain that these two representations that I cannot show you because they're not available anywhere on the internet, do show us the lesser mysteries of Herakles or Eleusis. Now, in the representation, a sieve is being shaken over Herakles' covered head, which is emblematic of purification and symbolic of the separation of evil from good, and symbolic of fecundity and resurrection. And at the right, Herakles, who's attired in a lion skin, in another representation in this particular urn, is standing barefoot by the Hierophant, holding a sacrificial pig by its hind legs. And this was the sacrifice of the pig for purification was done in the Eleusinian mysteries. The Hierophant is seen sprinkling the victim, that is the pig, from a pitcher with his right hand. On his left, he carries a flat earthen vessel on which 3 poppy heads appear. And Demeter is seated on the kista, holding a torch on which a serpent, which is a symbol of the Chthonian or Chthonic deities, is twined around. So this twining of the serpents around the torch represents Chthonic deities. The snake is licking the hand of Aeacus, who is the mystic god of the Eleusinian mysteries, who is resting on a mystic rod. And Demeter looks at Persephone, who is also holding a torch in her left hand. So we have the elements of purification by fire and water and earth. Right arm and breast bare. He's hoodwinked or blindfolded. He's unshod or slipshod, and torches are held in left or right hands. These same conventions you will find that have been carried forward even into the modern world in Freemasonry and other initiatic systems. These systems of initiation, which we're just now discovering as we work in the classics, have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and they've been brought forward in, even though the traditions are somewhat discontinuous as institutions. Freemasonry, as we know it today, was only founded a few hundred years ago, but it brought forward the initiatic traditions of the building guilds, and within them, in their initiatic traditions, they preserved these forms of initiation. So there you have it. The lesser mysteries of Herakles are mysteries that have to do with purification from evil, and they have to do with purification by fire and water and earth, and their preparation for the greater mysteries at Eleusis. Now let's take a look at the drama and the textual information that was handed on in the Eleusinian mysteries. These are the dromina and the legomena. And they are handed on in the telling and enacting of the legend and myth of Demeter and Persephone, and the interpretation of them as the myth is acted out in the body of the initiate, who is actually carrying out the passions and the orge of Demeter. So originally, Persephone is conceived by Demeter, who is impregnated by Zeus. So Zeus is the father of Persephone, and she is, her mother is a goddess, her father is a god, she is totally a divine being. Now, on the plane of Nyssa, Pluto, or Hades as he is known sometimes, kidnaps Persephone to be his wife. Now we have to understand that in the most ancient of the traditions, if we go back to early Cro-Magnon man and early Homo sapiens, and even back to the Neanderthals, the way that different clans got their wives was very often by kidnapping them from other clans, and it became very ritualized and eventually developed certain rituals of this, because people could not intermarry in their own clan or their own group. They really had to have blood from outside, and that was basic kind of thing that had to be done. And originally, tribes or groups interacted with each other in order to avoid bloodshed in very, very stylized ways. For example, Hermes, the thief, which we'll describe later, is the god who oversaw the business of trade between two tribes, and we'll discuss that much more in a later module, where one tribe would leave out, for example, olive oil that it had a surplus of and wished to trade for sheepskins. And this was done at a place where there was a herm, which is a specially designated kind of pillar. And then they would withdraw. Then members of the other tribe would come forward, and they would take the olive oil, and they would leave sheepskins. And they would withdraw. Then the other tribe would come forward and take the sheepskins. And if the trade was not considered to be equitable, they might end up having words or war or something like that. But in the same way, there had to be trades of women. There had to be women from other tribes that were brought in for marriage, because otherwise bloodlines would become polluted, and you would end up with brothers and sisters and cousins marrying. Well, in any case, if you've ever seen the movie 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, which is based upon the the rape, as it's called, of the 7 daughters, which is an ancient story that's still in the Greek mythology. Kidnapping was a notable way to take a bride, especially if it was from another clan or another group. In this case, this was an approved kidnapping, because the father of the bride, Zeus, had given permission to Pluto, who had asked for Persephone as his wife, and Father Zeus had said, yes, you may have her, go and take her. Now this place, the plain of Nyssa, was a place that was considered to be the omphalos, the navel of the world, the place where the underworld connected to the earth world. And it was one of the very few places, a sacred place, where this could occur. The Homeric hymn to Demeter describes the event in this way. Apart from Demeter, lady of the golden sword and glorious fruits, she, Persephone, was playing with the deep-bosomed daughters of Oceanus and gathering flowers over a soft meadow, roses and crocuses and beautiful violets, irises also and hyacinths and the narcissus, which earth made to grow at the will of Zeus and to please the host of many, and to be a snare for the bloom-like girl. A marvelous radiant flower. It was a thing of awe, whether for deathless gods or mortal men to see. From its root grew 100 blooms, and it smelled most sweetly, so that all wide heaven above and the whole earth and the sea's salt swell laughed for joy. And the girl was amazed and reached out with both hands to take the lovely toy. But the wide-pathed earth yawned there in the plain of Nyssa. And the Lord, host of many, with his immortal horses, sprang out upon her, the son of Kronos, he who has many names. And he caught her up, reluctant, on his golden car, and bare her away lamenting. Then she cried out shrilly with her voice, calling upon her father, the son of Kronos, who is most high and excellent. Well, this is a pretty lamentable situation. And there's a very negative view of the rape of Persephone. It's called the rape, it really is the kidnap. And it's been portrayed in art many times, of this poor girl being kidnapped, and she's very unwilling, and she's being taken away from her mother. Here are some of the images that we have seen, because this is a very popular theme in art. Here is the wild and fiery Lord of the underworld coming upon this poor girl out of the ground and grabbing her and carrying her away. It's full of fury and full of violence. He comes riding on his steeds with his trident, the trident of Pluto. He grabs her and takes her away unwillingly. And we think of this, and this is why it is called the rape of Persephone. But there is a more neutral view we get in some of the later painters who understood more deeply what the myth was about. And this is a medieval painting that shows the Lord of the Underworld snatching this girl and taking her away. And she doesn't look too terribly frightened. She's just doesn't know exactly what's going on, but it's kind of a neutral view. But then we find a very positive view of this in ancient art and in modern art, but especially in ancient Greek art, because this event is considered to be a holy and sacred event. If we take a look at this representation of Pluto, god of the underworld, and Persephone, it looks almost like a Hindu god and goddess, and the look on her face is pleasurable. It's very pleased. It's actually a very erotic kind of image, and it was a very erotic kind of myth And that's the way it was heard by people in their day. Here's one of the Greek images I like very much. In fact, I think this is very sexy. Here is Hades, Pluto, taking away or kidnapping the woman who will become his wife. And she doesn't really look very terrified. She looks really quite interested. And in this image, it's a wonderful image because it's, again, a painting from a Greek urn. Here, Pluto, or Hades, has a look of absolute adoration on his face. His wife is veiled as a bride would be, and if you look at her face, you'll see a smile on her face. And we have basically almost a bridal procession going on here. In fact, the marriage of Hades and Persephone was from the very beginning fated to occur. They were soulmates and lovers. They were both divine beings who were to be brought together in this way. And so actually in the stories of the divine underworld, they rule as a very happy king and queen, and they are deeply in love and adore each other. However, this is not a happy event for Demeter because she has lost her daughter. And the passion of Demeter, which is the grief and wandering of Demeter trying to find her daughter all over the earth, she's looking in the wrong place, and the search and sorrows of her are what, in fact, is imitated by the initiates in their initiatic procession to Eleusis. This is a via dolorosa, a way of sorrows. It's the very same thing that people do when they go through the 12 stations of the cross, or when they, at Easter time, walk the Via Dolorosa to the place of crucifixion of Jesus. No one, either of the deathless gods or mortal men, heard her voice, nor yet the olive trees bearing rich fruit. Only tender-hearted Hecate, bright-coiffed, the daughter of Perseus, heard the girl from her care, and the Lord Helios, Hyperion's bright son, as she cried to her father, the son of Cronos. But he was sitting aloof, apart from the gods, in his temple, where many pray, and receiving sweet offerings from mortal men. So he, that son of Cronos, of many names, who is ruler of many and host of many, was bearing her away by leave of Zeus on his immortal chariot, his own brother's child, and all unwilling. And so long as she, the goddess, yet beheld earth and starry heaven and the strong flowing sea where fishes shoal and the rays of the sun, and still hoped to see her dear mother and the tribes of the eternal gods, so long hope calmed her great heart for all her trouble, and the heights of the mountains and the depths of the sea rang with her immortal voice, and her queenly mother heard her. Bitter pain seized her heart, and she rent the covering upon her divine hair with her dear hand. Her dark cloak she cast down from both her shoulders and sped like a wild bird over the firm land and yielding sea, seeking her child. But no one would tell her the truth, neither god nor mortal man, and of the birds of omen none came with true news for her. And then for 9 days queenly Deo, that's a name for Demeter, wandered over the earth with flaming torches in her hands, so grieved that she never tasted ambrosia and the sweet draught of nectar, nor sprinkled her body with water. The wanderings of Demeter to find her stolen child, Persephone, constitute what is the passion or the orge of Demeter, and it is this that is imitated in the procession of the initiates and in other activities of the initiates. Callimachus indicates how these legends may have been incorporated into the rites of initiation. He says, "As the basket comes, greet it, you women, saying, Demeter, greatly hail, lady of much bounty, of many measures of corn. As the basket comes from the ground, you shall see it, you uninitiated, and gaze not from the roof or from aloft, child nor wife nor maid that has shed her hair, neither then nor when we spit from parched mouths fasting. Hesperus from the clouds marks the time of its coming, Hesperus who alone persuaded Demeter to drink. That time she pursued the unknown tracks of her stolen daughter. Lady, how were your feet able to carry you to the west, to the black men, and where the golden apples are? You did not drink, nor did you eat during that time, nor did you wash. Thrice did you cross Herakles with his silver eddies, and as often did you pass over each of the ever-flowing rivers. And thrice did you seat yourself on the ground beside the fountain of Callichorus, parched and without drinking, and did not eat nor wash. Remember, Callichorus is the spring upon which the Eleusinian grounds are founded as a sacred place. During her wanderings and her journeys, Demeter runs into different entities and gods and goddesses who try to cheer her up. Iambe, which is the goddess associated with iambic pentameter, speaks to her in verse. Balbo tries to cheer up with women's jokes, which involve the genitals and things like that, very body-type jokes. And nothing is able to cheer her. Finally, she comes upon the abode of the Eumolpidae, who will later become the Eumolpid priests, the family, the dynasty of the Eumolpids. And in some stories, it's just a little peasant's cottage. In some stories, it's a king and a queen who rule a territory. Now, the queen or the peasant wife is Metanira, and her little son is Demophon. And as a substitute for her lost daughter, the grieving Demeter offers her services as a wet nurse to nourish Demophon and to take care of him in exchange for food and drink. Now, the Eumolpidae do not know that this is the goddess, Demeter, the great goddess, because she has her veil over her head and no light comes out. And so they think of her as just an old woman who is seeking a position somewhere. Now, in taking care of this little child, Demeter becomes very attached to the child and begins to love him just as she did her own daughter. So she loves a human child as a substitute for the lost daughter. This is a goddess, and she's not a demigod. She's a pure goddess who is loving a human child as in place of her lost daughter. And so she decides she's going to confer immortality upon his soul. And she does this in the magical way of the gods by holding him in the flames. And so at night, when nobody's around, she holds the little child in the flames of the fire and slowly starts to transform him into an immortal. However, Metanira walks in when she's doing this and screams and yells, "What are you doing to my child?" And at that point, Demeter lifts her veil. The room is filled with light. Metanira falls down on her knees in front of her and she says, "I was conferring immortality upon your child, but you interrupted the process. Henceforth, he will not be totally immortal. He will be half mortal and half immortal. His body will be mortal and his soul will become immortal." And at that point, she decides to establish her mysteries, to confer her boons upon human beings. And she establishes her mysteries with the Eumolpid priesthood, which becomes hereditary, and her mysteries become the Eleusinian mysteries according to the legend and the myth. There are several cultic objects that go along with the myth and the stories that are kept by the Hierophant and kept by the Eumolpid dynasty. These are the kistae and a certain kind of a rattle. They also are taught the synthema, which is legomena, which are words that are spoken, sort of like a creed. And they build a telesterion, and at the back of the telesterion, an anacteron, where the highest form of initiation can be established. So here is a representation of Demeter and the Kore, her little daughter, represented as a very small statue. in the sense of the representing of the child, the human child, as a substitute for the Kore. And she takes this child under her protection, and this child becomes destined for apotheosis. And so the idea is that a goddess who would normally not grant this kind of a boon to a human being has granted immortality to those whom she will initiate into her mysteries. And this has happened because she has lost her daughter, and she has essentially adopted a human child and come to love the human child, and therefore wants to confer upon it immortality. Now, the last part of the myth involves the return of Persephone, the Kore, the maiden, for 2/3 of each year. Needless to say, this corresponds with the spring and the summer and the fall of the year, when seeds are planted and grown and harvested. Now, let's first say, and let's be very clear, that at this point, Persephone is very happy. She loves being the wife of Pluto, and Pluto is devoted to her, she is devoted to him. And all the representations we get of them at this point show them as the great lovers of the divine underworld. And she enjoys her position as being the queen of the underworld, the queen of the mysteries of death and the mysteries of immortality. And she rules with her husband the mysteries of death and rebirth and initiation. You notice in this representation, we have a rooster. Why the rooster? Well, in the later mysteries we will study, the chthonic mysteries of the full Archetype, when one wished to receive an oracle and when one was able to get into the trance and descend into it with the guidance of a full Arcus, then this divine revelation came from under the earth, from the underworld. Now, what time of the day did it come? Well, it came in the morning, but before the sun rose. If you've ever owned a rooster, you will note that the rooster does not crow at the break of dawn. The rooster starts crowing about an hour and a half before the sun actually comes up. And that period of time, an hour and a half or 2 hours before the sun rises to the time that the sun actually rises, which is the time that the roosters crow, is the time that priests receive oracles, and they receive the messages from those who are so-called dead, and they receive the divine prophecies from the gods. When one has done the deep work of the night, it's at that time that the fruits of that work come through and people receive them. So the rooster is associated with that part of the underworld. And also, if you've ever had a rooster, you know that roosters hump every chicken in sight all the time. So rooster is also a symbol of fertility, rebirth, the creation of eggs, and the earth is envisioned in the great Orphic mysteries as a cosmic egg that is hatched, and the same also in the Egyptian mysteries. So the rooster is a very, very important symbol, and the sacrifice of a cock or a rooster, it becomes very important in Hellenistic religion. Now, nobody is going to tell Demeter what has happened, because Zeus is fully responsible. The only ones who know are Hecate, who has seen what has happened, and Helios, who has observed the whole thing from the sky. And in legends, it is Hecate, sometimes it's Helios, who finally tells Demeter, after she has established her mysteries with the Eumolpidae, the whereabouts of her child, that she has been, by permission of the father Zeus, she has been taken to Hades to be the bride of Pluto. Here's a representation from Eleusis itself of the sisterhood between Demeter and Hecate. This is from about 450 BC. Hecate is what we call a triple goddess. Here we see she has 6 arms and 6 legs and 2 heads, 3 heads, and she wears the horns of the downturned horns of the moon. She represents prophecy, magical work from the underworld, etc. Hecate is an extremely important character in the Chthonic mysteries, and she is always related to things that have to do with magic and so on. And so Demeter gets really mad at Zeus, and so she puts a curse on everything. She puts on her shroud, and she refuses to let the crops grow. She refuses to let the weather become sun-like, like summer. She causes winter to fall upon the whole earth, and the human beings will not be able to grow crops. They will starve, and they will therefore not be able to make their proper offerings to the gods, their cakes and their sacrificial animal offerings, etc. Now she has Zeus's attention. Now she's she's being heard. It's the woman's way of pressuring the man. And so Zeus sends a messenger to her, Hermes, and says, you've got to stop this. You've got to bring back the fecundity of the earth. You've got to stop everything being cold and dark and nothing growing, and everything is like winter, because we, the gods, need to be nourished by the offerings and sacrifices and worship of the humans. And she says, no deal. No deal. Not until I get my daughter back. Well, Zeus has promised the girl to Pluto. In some legends, Pluto is one of his sons. In some legends, he's actually one of the sons of Demeter. But he's a very powerful god, a very important god. And his word, Zeus's word, cannot be changed. And so he says, well, I'll tell you what, if she can go for the entire year without eating, if she fasts, does not eat, then she can come back and return to the earth. And so that information is given forth to Persephone through the messenger Mercury, Hermes, who is also the psychopomp, the guide of the dead, and descends into the underworld heap. Now, Persephone loves pomegranates. Here is a representation of her taking pomegranates from the giant pomegranate bush. It doesn't really, grow on trees. They grow on very, very large bushes and vines. And so she fasts and refuses to eat because she does want to come back and visit her mother. And she goes through the fasting, but no matter how much she fasts, she finally decides she has to have some nourishment. Even goddesses need nourishment. And so she eats the seed of a pomegranate, one seed of a pomegranate. And that nullifies the promise. So finally a deal is struck. The deal is struck that she can return to the earth for 2/3 of the year each year, but then she has to return to her husband, to the underworld. And that is agreeable to her and to her husband and to her mother and to everybody. And so Persephone returns, and Persephone is actually a personification of the prana, of the life force that comes up out of the earth from Pluto and graces the earth in spring and summer and reaches its final culmination in the fall with the harvest, and then returns under the earth again. And when Persephone returns to the earth, then joy is restored to her mother's heart, and the earth brings forth fruit and blooms. But you have to understand that it's not just Demeter who brings forth these things. It's the daughter of Demeter. It's the offspring of Demeter. It's that great divine force that is married to the underworld that comes from Pluto himself. Now, Diodorus Siculus tells a very interesting version of this myth that's quite different. He tells about Demeter, who falls in love with Iasion. and yields to him in a thrice-plowed fallow field. This is very, very reminiscent of fertility rites that were done in plowed fields in some of the ancient Near Eastern cultures. And when Zeus heard about it, he was jealous, and he came and killed Iasion with his thunderbolts, which made him, of course, immortal. But Zeus desired that the other of his two sons might also attain to honor, and so he instructed him in the initiatory rite of the mysteries, which has existed on the island since ancient times. That's the island of Crete, but was at that time, so to speak, put into his hands. That's Iasion. It is not lawful, however, for any but the initiated to hear about the mysteries, and Iasion is reputed to have been the first initiate to initiate strangers into them, and by this means to bring the initiatory rite to high esteem. And Demeter, becoming enamored of Iasion, presented him with the fruit of the earth. To Iasion and Demeter, according to the story the myths relate, was born Plutus, or wealth. That's Pluto, or Hades, as he's sometimes called. But the reference is, as a matter of fact, to the wealth of the wheat, corn, and barley, which was presented to Iasion because of Demeter's association with him at the time of the wedding of Harmonia. Now, the details of the initiatory rite are guarded among the matters not to be divulged and are communicated to the initiates alone, but the fame has traveled wide of how these gods appear to mankind and bring unexpected aid to those initiates of theirs who call upon them in the midst of perils. The claim is also made that men who have taken part in the mysteries become both more pious and more just and better in every respect than they were before. And this is the reason we are told why the most famous, both of the ancient heroes and of the demigods, were eagerly desirous of taking part in the initiatory rite. And in fact, Jason and the Dioscuri and Herakles and Orpheus as well, after their initiation, attained success in all the campaigns they undertook because these gods appeared to them. So the myth that I'm telling you is just one way of looking and tying together all these stories. There are many other ways of doing it, and we're not sure exactly what the story was that was told to people and what they were exactly acting out in these rites, because they have been guarded and they went to the grave of all the initiates. Now, we do know that the highest part of the initiatic mysteries of Eleusis were the nocturnal epoptia, and the people who experienced were called epochs. And they experienced it in the Anacteron, which is a very small sanctuary in the Telesterion, and they were qualified to come back and receive that highest initiation at least a year after their basic initiation. Now, the lesser mysteries of Eleusis are the purifications. The basic initiation of Eleusis seemed to be what we're going to describe to you, and then the highest initiation was in the Anacteron after a year or so. Now, in the myths, there is another character you have to know, Triptolemus. Triptolemus is the name of the being who is sent forth from Demeter and Persephone to teach mankind the skills and the knowledge of agriculture and of bringing forth wealth from the earth in the form of grain, etc. And you will see Triptolemus and his representations at the end of the ceremonies in Eleusis. Here is a grand relief in Eleusis of Triptolemus with Persephone and Demeter. Here is a drawing to bring out the detail. He, of course, is represented as much smaller because he's a demigod or a human, depending upon what you read. And these are the Greek goddesses themselves. He is set forth into the world after Persephone and the mother are reunited, and he is set forth into the world to bring forth the knowledge of how to grow grains. Here is on a herm, you see him seated on a winged chariot, and he's going to go forth and spread this knowledge across the earth. And here he's being sent off by the goddesses. Here is another representation of that same thing, the departure of Triptolemus. that coincides somewhat with what is done in the enacteron in the highest initiation. All we know is that people contemplated sheaves of grain after having seen the great light of the goddess in the enacteron. And we'll talk more about that in just a little while. Now we want to look at some of the offices and some of the vocabulary associated with the mysteries before we look at the exact structure of them. There was an archon basileus. It really means a ruling king. And he was an Athenian magistrate, and many of his assistants were in charge of the non-religious aspects of the celebration. The chief religious official was the Hierophant, who was the high priest at Eleusis for life and was always from the family of the Eumolpids. And his family descended from Eumolpus, the ruler of Eleusis, who appears in the Homeric hymn Demeter. And the Hierophant, or high priest of Demeter, was the one who revealed the Hiera, the sacred objects, to initiates, and we don't know exactly what they were. He alone could decide whether to accept or reject a potential initiate. He could marry, but during the celebration he had to be chaste. In Roman times, he was a hieronymus, meaning that his name could not be uttered under the threat of severe punishment. Now, we don't know what the dress of the high priest or the hierophant might be, but here we have the Magna Mater, the Syrian Magna Mater, Kubale, with her lion guardians who represent the power of Athens or the power of Adonis. And we see her seated with a crown and certain kinds of robes in the guise of the Hierophant, because she is the Hierophant of her mysteries. So possibly the robes of the Hierophant of the Eleusinian mysteries would have somewhat resembled these things. There would have been something over the head, a crown, etc. We will be interested to see later on that as we look at the development of Christian vestments for priests and so on, that they originated in the mysteries and the mystery cults and were designed on the same kinds of designs that we find in these mysteries and the mysteries of Isis. Now, the Hierophantides were two priestesses, one who served Demeter and one who served Persephone. And they had the privilege of hieronymy, that is, their names could not be pronounced. And they were from the family of the Eumolpids and held up positions for life. And the priestess of Demeter belonged to the family of the Eumolpids and lived in the sacred house at Eleusis. And she held the office for life, and she was the one whose name appeared on dates and inscriptions. She even had the license to dispute with the Hierophant over sacrificial procedures. There were priestesses Panages. They were women ministers, and we're not quite sure what they did. They seemed to have the privilege of being allowed to touch the Hiera, or the sacred objects. The Daducus was the torchbearer, and he was the one who led the procession. We do have an image of a Daducus that we can present here. That is a Daducus from Eleusis, and this is portrayed because the Daducus would lead processions out in public where people could see them. So he's holding a torch and he's in robes, and you notice he has leaves, the laurel leaves on his head, the leaves of victory. The Hierocarex, Hiero means priestly, carex means herald, is the herald of the initiates. This is the person who makes announcements. There was an altar priest who was probably responsible for animal sacrifices. And lesser officials included the Phthentes, who was a man who cleaned the statues of the gods. And very often the statues in the ancient world were not only cleaned, they were dressed. And so you had stolismai who dressed the statues and cared for them and offered food to them and so on. There was the Hydronus, who purified the initiates with water. We don't know whether it was male or female. It has actually a female ending as I'm presenting it, but I believe that it's presented mostly with a male ending, so it's probably a man. Purified the initiates with water. the Neochorus, who was in charge of cleaning and decorating the sanctuary, and there were numerous other priests and priestesses responsible for the singing involved in the celebration. And lastly, every year, one young boy or girl from an aristocratic Athenian family was voted to be initiated at the state's expense. And this child performed the rites and the role of Demophon, who led the worshippers in choric dancing. And it had to be led because you were taught as you did it. And so the child was probably deeply trained to do this sort of thing, and he played the role of Demophon. The Mystes were the people who were undergoing the rites. They were called Mystes. A mystagogue was the one who led them into the initiatic rites, and a mystagogue very often had been the person who nominated people. And Epoptes was a person who had experienced the highest form of initiation and the highest form of vision, the divine visio beatifica, who had experienced that in the Enecteron. And there was a high priestess at Demeter, and there was one of the priestesses who were the Hierophantades, who played this role, and the role was one of Hieros Gamos, which represented the marriage of Persephone and Pluto and and Hades. The Telesterion was the big sanctuary in which the rites of the major rites of Eleusis were conducted. And the Enecteron was a small room, the small sanctuary inside the Telesterion, where the final and finishing highest form of initiation was conferred. And in the Enecteron, a small number of people were taken with the Hierophant and the High Priestess. And all we know is that people's descriptions are that from across the bay at midnight, far away, suddenly there was a great, gigantic flash of light. Brighter than lightning. It lasted for just an instant. So something was going on there in the Enecteron. We do have a story of a Brahmin priest who came for initiation, and he jumped into the flames, it says, and the Enecteron was totally consumed, and he became considered to have been apotheosized at that very moment. But there were some kinds of flames and very bright light that was made to appear, and in that light there was a vision that each person saw in his own way according to what he had, what images he had in his own mind. And after that very bright light, they went out to another area where there was sheaves of grain on an altar, and they contemplated that and the vision they had, and they had seen the goddess Persephone or Demeter. We don't know exactly what they experienced. So these are the greater mysteries of Eleusis, and I'm going to give you a blow-by-blow account of how it went day by day. Now, they were a set of rites surrounded by a major multi-day festival, and they were held once each year over 9 days, because remember the 9 days are the days of the wanderings of Demeter. In the early fall, partly in the city of Athens and partly in the nearby town of Eleusis, the sanctuary, initiates came from all over Greek and later the Roman world, and messengers from Eleusis proclaimed a holy truce in Greek city-states lasting 55 days. No one would violate that truce. Now, the activities began on the day before the first official day of the mysteries, when a procession carried the so-called Hyra, or mysterious holy things, whose nature is unknown, from Eleusis to Athens after preliminary sacrifices. So the sacred things were removed from their place of safety and protection in Eleusis and probably in the Enecteron, and they were moved now out into the city of Athens. The procession would stop to rest at a sacred fig tree, and where, according to later legend, Demeter was cared for by Philotas, and as a reward she gave him a fig tree. And the procession then went into Athens to the city Eleusinian, which is a temple of Demeter in Athens near the Acropolis. Now, on the first day of the mysteries, the Archon Basileus summoned the people to the Agora, which is the marketplace of Athens, and in the presence of the Hierophant and the Deducus, read a proclamation calling forth the initiates. These are the people who had been accepted as those to be initiated. Now, these are people who had spent many years preparing. Many of them were younger. As children, they had grown up learning and studying the philosophy and many other things that were involved in preparing for initiation. And these were people who had gone through their probationary period and now were going to actually be initiated. Those who were forbidden from participating included those who had committed homicide, barbarians, that is, after foreigners, that came after the Persian Wars, and those who could not understand Greek. So those who then were announced admitted could enter the Eleusinian after washing their hands in sacred water at the door. This is an image that we have of a young initiate dressed for initiation. You notice that his breast is exposed. He's holding an object that is probably going to be a torch, and he's clothed in a robe that may or may not have been a white robe, but was a pure linen garment. His hair is styled in a specific way. This person has fasted, sacrificed, and undergone purification rituals. Now, the second day was the day of purification in the sea. And at that time, people sacrificed a piglet. And this is a very ancient practice that goes way back before the founding of Eleusis and the Eleusinian mysteries. But they walked to the sea near Athens, and they cleansed themselves, and they cleansed a small pig. And then when they returned, they sacrificed the pig. Now, on the third day, the day of sacrifices, we're not quite sure what was done, but it seems that the Archon Basileus made sacrifices on behalf of Athens, and various delegations sent to Athens for the occasion made sacrifices on behalf of their home cities. At this time, people had undergone the purification, and so they were undoubtedly fasting and preparing themselves for the experience. Now, the fourth day was called the Asclepia, because it commemorated the late purification of the god Asclepius. According to legend, Asclepius, who was the great healer who became a god, he arrived at Athens a day late for his purification, and so in order to accommodate him, he was such a great being, the purification rites were repeated so that he could be properly initiated into the mysteries. So on the fourth day, those participants who arrived late undergo the purifications, and those who had already been purified stay home and get further instruction. Now, the fifth day was known as the Pompe, or procession. Officials and initiates and sponsors proceeded to Eleusis from Athens on foot, a distance of about 14 miles. Now, originally, everybody walked in the procession, but about the time of the 4th century, before the Christian era, the wealthy rode in carriages, and the priests and the Hierophant also began riding in carriages about this time. At the head of the procession was a statue of Iacchus. He was the god of the mysteries, the unknown god, who was the personification of the excitement and noise of the procession. Now, the procession itself could be noisy and loud and a little bit rowdy. In fact, there were times along the road when there were special body jokes and jests that were done. Plutarch describes the serious reverence on the final night as being analogous to the deepest calm of a philosopher. He says, just as persons who are being initiated into the mysteries throng together at the outset amid tumult and shouting and jostle against one another, but when the holy rites are being performed and disclosed, the people are immediately attentive in awe and silence. So too, he says, at the beginning of philosophy, things are this way. So we know that the procession did not start out as a silent procession. It was probably a noisy procession, and Iacchus was the god of that noisy procession. And there are other things that typify the procession we know about. After the initiates had crossed the bridge of the river Retoi, an event known as the Crocosis took place, which is named for Crocus, the first inhabitant of the region. Here, his descendants would tie a woolen croquet, which is a saffron-colored ribbon around the right hand and left leg of each initiate. Here is a painting of the initiates having the croquet tied around them. It's not a red thread as it is in certain other mysteries. It's a saffron-colored thread. This probably gave the initiates a chance to rest until sunset, when the procession continued. Now, once they reached the river Kephissus, men with covered heads known as the Gephrismoi waited to hurl insults and jeers and mockery and abuse at the initiates. And this included some of the greatest citizens of Athens. It's not quite clear what the purpose of it was, but it represented the proper emotions and feelings of humbling that had to happen in order to imitate the Orge of Demeter. In any case, this ritual may have been also to bring out evil spirits and the ideas of the attacking of Demeter and her suffering and so on, but it echoes a kind of vulgarized evolution of the soothing jokes of Iambe, which were given to cheer Demeter. And finally, when they arrived, there were dances and festivities, and the initiates were finally dispersed to rest for the night. Now here's the bridge that people finally had to cross in order to come over. And the bridge goes into an area that is not part of the sacred groves, but is right outside of the temple precincts and the sacred groves. And it's in this area that what were called the bridge jests were given. And there were also other kinds of things that were done, the imitation of the role of Balbo. Balbo tried to cheer Demeter by lifting her skirt and showing her pudenda, and giving various kinds of body jokes, etc. We have these representations of Balbo and what she meant in the mysteries. So it's a kind of the first part, the trials and the kind of rough edges of all the things that go into the procession itself. When they finally reached the sacred precincts, there was dancing and there was celebration. There were many torches, and people finally went off to rest from their celebrations. Now, these dances may have been choric dances. They may have been dances that were led by Demophoon, or they may simply have been dances of celebration. Now, we don't know a lot about what happened on the sixth day. The sixth day were called the telete, the finishing parts, or the rites. It was probably a day of fasting and purification, and it was probably at this time that they drank the sacred drink, the kaikion, which seems to have been a tea made of pennyroyal that could help stimulate the imagination, and when people had not eaten and they had fasted, it might have made them more suggestible to hypnotic activities and so on. We don't know. However, Kakian does not seem to have been anything that was really intoxicating, like the alcoholic beverages of the Dionysian mysteries. But this was in commemoration of Demeter's refusal to drink red wine during the time of her passion and so on. So further sacrifices were made by the Archon Basileus before the final initiation began. We only know that this consisted of the dromena, things enacted, and probably a dramatic representation of this part of the Orge of Demeter. Probably a series of brief liturgical or invocational statements. And the things that were said, telegomena, we know were given here, and the things that were said and taught were perhaps the synthema, which is sort of like a creed, except it was a sort of a kind of very short statement using several words that would mean things to the initiates. We know what the synthema was, and I will recite the synthema to you. One ancient writer tells us the following: the non-secret part of the synthema and of the test that people were given to be certain they were proper initiates was to recite this, and this is the non-secret part. I have fasted, drunk the kakian, taken things out of the big basket, and after performing a rite, put them into the little basket. Once I put them back in the big basket. So that's as much as we know, and this was really a non-secret part because this was done actually during the crocosis itself. Now here we have some representations of lamps that were found from Eleusis archaeologically that would have been lit at certain times and at nighttime because the rites would have been nocturnal. And this is a carving, a wall facade that shows Persephone and Demeter holding sacred things, perhaps the sacred objects, which we know are things like a rattle and other kinds of things, a basket and so on that we're not sure about. But we think that basically the initiates participated in sacred choric dancing. They were probably instructed in it and probably led by the little child. And this concept of a child leading a group of people is a very important thing that means a lot in philosophy and means a great deal, for example, in Christianity. A little child shall lead them is a phrase that we find in the Old Testament. It's a phrase you find applied in the New Testament, in the teachings of Jesus, who says the little ones will go into the kingdom of heaven before you, and in some of the Gnostic teachings, that the little children will lead them forward and all this sort of thing. Well, this concept of a child leading people is very, very crucial to what happened in the mysteries. Here we have a carving of either Demophon and Demeter, or the chosen child and the high priestess of Demeter. In either case, this chosen child is very, very important. It really stands for all of humanity. It stands for the immortal soul of each one. And so for this child to lead people in choric dancing, that is dancing in which everybody makes the same motions together, was highly symbolic. It was highly symbolic that it was a child who did this. Because in the mysteries of immortality, the youth, the kouros, the kore, the youth that represents the immortal resuscitation and rejuvenation, resurrection of the soul into immortal life, is perhaps one of the most profound. Choric dancing is something that originated in Crete and was taught to people, and it was taught mostly. Here we have a carving of either Demeter. Choric dancing is something. Choric dancing is something that originated in Crete and was taught to people. And it was taught mostly to younger children because it was like puberty rites. They were being taught these dances. And if you knew these dances and you could perform them, you were performing a sacred function in the community. Dancing among the Greeks developed to have many, many meanings, but in the sacred context, dancing was a form of group mudra, group posture, group motion, group rhythm, and the whole group unifying and bringing themselves together as part of a greater entity. And if you study Greek dancing, you'll see that there are many, many modalities, and they're each very specific, and there's much to learn in each of them. In fact, an educated child of this period, or an educated adult, will be one who knew many or most of these dances and can participate in them. And the sacred dancing that was done in the sanctuary at Eleusis was probably very similar to the dances that were done on the island of Crete. Now, the final vision, the thing that was seen and understood, the visio beatifica, was done in the Nectaron, or the little palace. It was a small room in which a manifestation could take place, and all we know is that witnesses across the bay describe brilliant flash of light. And after this, somehow the worshippers saw Persephone, or the core, or the Virgin, in this, and processed awestruck to a small sanctuary to meditate upon a sheaf of grain. And this experience was the seminal experience and the final experience of the Eleusinian mysteries. An imaginative description by Edward Shore from his book called The Great Initiate says, "Crowned with myrtle along with the other initiates, we enter the entrance hall of the temple, still blind, that is blindfolded. But the Hierophant who is within will soon open our eyes. But first, for nothing is to be done in haste, let us wash in the holy water. We are led before the Hierophant. From a book of stone he reads us things which we must not divulge under penalty of death. Let us say only that they are in harmony with the place and the circumstances." You would laugh perhaps if you heard them outside the temple, but here you have no desire to laugh as you listen to the words of the elder, for he is always old. And as you look at the exposed symbols, and you are far from laughing when, by her special language and signs, the vivid sparkling of light and clouds piled upon clouds, Demeter confirms everything that we have seen. And then finally the light of a serene wonder fills the temple. We see the pure Elysian fields. We hear the chorus of the blessed ones. Now it is not merely through an external appearance or through a philosophical interpretation, but in fact and in reality that the Hierophant becomes the creator and the revelator of all things. So that's one way of looking at it. In all the initiations and the mysteries, the gods manifest themselves in many forms. Kareni describes a painted marble votive relief of the 5th century found in the excavation of the Telesterion that was dedicated to Demeter by Eucrates, and over the inscription is carved the face and head of the goddess surrounded by red rays. Proclus tells us that the word gods in this instance refers to all the orders of spirits that assume a great variety of guises, and sometimes they appear in a formless light again in quite different forms. So we can't say exactly what the experience was, but on the 8th day of the celebrations, when the initiate's last day at Eleusis drew near, then they devoted these to pouring out libations for the dead and rites for the dead. Now, Athenaeus tells us of a ritual performed which gave this day the name the Plemachoi. The plemico is an earthen dish shaped like a top, but tolerably firm on its base. Some call it egg koteliskas, according to pamphlets. They use it at Eleusis on the last day of the mysteries, a day which they call from it Plemachoi. On that day, they fill 2 plemachoi and they invert them, standing up and facing east in the one case, etc. And in the west in the other, and they recite a mystical formula over them. And this is probably followed by celebrations of singing and dancing and other festivities. And then on the 9th day, the initiates returned to Athens. This was not an organized procession. People just went directly, or they walked on the road to Athens, not the sacred way, and they were free to return to their lives. Those who had been initiated in the normal way could return in a year, assuming they were accepted by the Hierophant, and they could become the highest initiates, the Hypoptes, and they could see the vision in the Telesterion, or they could choose not to do that, or they could come many years later if they were accepted. Well, we're going to bid adieu to Persephone and Hades for a short time, but they're going to become very important to us in the later oracular traditions and the other chthonic traditions of the Greeks. So we will leave them in their heaven, which unfortunately in the Christian world is hell and Hades, but in the divine underworld is the place of joy and afterlife and wealth, guarded by the 3-headed dog Cerberus. And we will meet up with them again in later modules as we study the Greek Initiatic mysteries. This is the end of Module 5.